Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support this transmission. You can do that by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month, a little over $90 a year. You get a discount if you purchase the annual. And every week or two, I schedule a group Zoom chat for supporters only, where whoever likes to join, we can shoot the breeze on world events. And I also do a weekly write-up of the best of the news headlines and my commentary. And sometimes we bring back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A for supporters only. You can donate through the website, geopoliticsandempire.com. You can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about whatever you like. I'm an open book, and affiliates, check them out. They're at the website, Wise Wolf Gold, Escape the Technocracy, Above Phone, Societatis Civis. That also helps support the work. And leave a podcast review if you have not already. And share my stuff. Joining us for the first time is Charles Hugh Smith. He's the author of the of2minds.com blog, and he's listed as one of the top alternative financial sites. He's also the author of 18 books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Tech, and Creating Jobs for All, Global Crisis, National Renewal, A Revolutionary Grand Strategy for the U.S., Burnout, Reckoning, and Renewal, Self-Reliance in the 21st Century. I've got a bunch of his books on Kindle. Here I've got The Mythology of Progress on my Kindle. His work is published on a number of popular financial websites, including Zero Hedge, Financial Sense, Seeking Alpha, and he's been featured on many podcasts. Welcome finally to Geopolitics and Empire, Charles.
Thank you very much, Favourier. It's my pleasure to join such an august cast of previous guests.
Well, it's an eclectic cast of characters I like to entertain, and I've been a longtime reader, Charles, and it's awesome to finally get to chat. And over the years, I may have sent, I think, an interview request once or twice to Novale, and you were probably busy, and that's how things work. And the same happens to me. And a listener the other day told me, just contact him again. And I did, and I got an immediate response. And it's funny how that works. And, I think one of your first books that I purchased many years ago, a decade ago probably, was Get a Job, Build a Career, and Defy a Bewildering Economy. And it influenced me in many ways, among other books. I realized that I couldn't and shouldn't just get a 9-to-5 job and be mediocre and clock in and clock out. And, I worked in education for a decade. And so I sought self-mastery and to teach myself new skills through hobbies. And, one of them was podcasting, and which for many years was just a moonlight hobby. And, now here we are. And, I want to get back to this toward the end of our discussion in the solutions section. But to start out, I always ask my guests their big picture view. And you say that we're on the crumbling margins of the status quo. And so if you could, just to start big, and then we can drill on down. In your mind, what's going on? Where are we? Trump 2.0, talk of World War III, financial resets, global elites, and so forth.
Well, that's a great intro topic, Rory, and thank you for that. I, like a lot of people, I think I kind of start with, we're still running wetware 1.0. And in other words, the human species was pretty much as it is now 200,000 years ago or so. And the hunter-gatherer era, and then this whole civilization, urbanization, industrialization, it's been kind of tacked on. It's like the last few seconds of our human journey. And so are we completely adapted to that? These rapid changes and the different dynamics of these eras, and it would be difficult to say, oh yeah, sure, we're so immensely adaptable, we're infinitely adaptable, and we're everything's fine now. And it's all like, well, I'm always skeptical of that. Like, I think, well, underneath it all, we have social and cultural and individual needs, because that's how we were selected by natural selection, right? So if those needs aren't being met despite our creature comforts, then we're actually unhappy despite being told constantly how happy we are. So that's kind of a context of individual status of being, shall we say, and also like a social status of being. Like, are we really meeting our fundamental human needs or not? So that's a question that goes into a lot of different areas. And so that's one context. Another one is history. In other words, because we're still running what we're 1.0, we can look at previous empires and nation states and civilizations, and learn quite a bit about how humans respond when they're under pressure or they're at a crossroads. And many great civilizations are poorly documented, unfortunately, and so we only have archaeological records, but even those can be quite, informational. Other previous civilizations, like the Roman era, we have some tiny shred of their written material, which is enough to give us a little bit of insight into how they responded and what happened to them. And what's interesting, as you well know, is that it turns out there's still a dialogue, still a narrative, a conflicting sort of churn about what these previous civilizations experienced and what we can learn from them. And so every new generation takes another look at these past at history and comes up with a different set of insights, and so that's what makes history interesting. It's not really static, because new things are discovered and there's new interpretations. And so that's kind of, sorry to say so broadly, that's how I'm going to kind of come to our discussion, is what can we learn from the past, and how does it reflect on the present, which is, of course, considerably different in so many ways. And you go, well, what's the main difference? And the main difference is, of course, the hydrocarbon industrial age that started in the early 1800s and has now taken over the entire world, right? That's the global world system, if you will. And so the question is that sustainable or not? And what changes will that affect on the world if it's not sustainable? And so there's two basic huge narratives at kind of in conflict here in the present day. One narrative is technology is supreme, it's unlimited because human ingenuity is unlimited, and we're going to have continual, permanent abundance of everything. And in fact, we're going to enter a period of superabundance, right? Because of tech, essentially, right? And in tech includes AI and new mining technologies, fracking, and so on and so forth. The alternative narrative is we've used up all the easy to get stuff, all the cheap to access stuff. And now we're facing resource constraints because we've strip mined the seas, we've depleted the soil and fresh water, and we've taken out all the easy to get minerals and hydrocarbons. And so now we're going to have resource constraints, and that's going to change the world, regardless of technology. So that I want to talk today a little bit about the idea that these two narratives seem to be in two different camps. Like when you listen to people who are into resource depletion and monitoring, that kind of overconsumption, they don't really talk much about geopolitics. It tends to be like, well, we need to recycle more, or recycling's failing. We need a new system or something like that. It tends to be inside their own nation state. And so it's relatively rare for someone to take the environmental issues or the resource issues and say, well, how is this going to affect these big moving parts in geopolitics?
Yeah, I've interviewed, I had my old radio show. I've interviewed folks like Art Berman, who focuses on oil, and he's got an interesting view on a lot of this. And I was just rereading. I came across a 2012 white paper this week from Coca-Cola, 2012, and they were talking about imposing top-down personal carbon allowances. And like I said, I interview the full spectrum. I'm out of my league on different topics, which is why I bring on guests. And sometimes I don't know. I've asked that question to many guests. Are resources more finite or scarce, or are elites lying to us so they can impose controls, or could it be both? It's not just one or two, but please continue.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and Art Berman is a good example of the analysts who question the standard kind of narrative that everything's going to be fine because we can always get a substitute resource for something that's been depleted. I think you raise a very good point, which is I think what's kind of forgotten or not looked at so much is where is waste and squandering resources fit into this. And humans, by our parent nature, we like windfalls. Like the hunter gatherer comes upon a tree loaded with fruit, they strip it and then they move on because you know what, that tree's, they didn't kill the tree. The tree will recover and have fruit next season. And of course, if you're a hunter gatherer, you're aware of these seasonal changes. You're tied into your awareness of the natural world intently because you're living off of it. So they don't think anything is wrong with taking all the fruit. Why not? And so we bring that mentality to finance, globalization, colonization, and so we sort of we don't really seem to have any awareness, at least not without conscious effort, that when we strip mine an asset now on a global scale, there is no coming back next season. The fishery is ruined. It's gone. It's been stripped. Or you chop down the entire forest. A tree farm is not a substitute for a wild forest, right? Just like a fish farm is not a substitute for wild fisheries, and so on. And so on a global scale, we seem to have lost touch with scale. And I often talk about scale as something that we don't understand. And in math class, we learned about orders of magnitude and this kind of thing. And you go, okay, let's see, one order, okay, 10 times, two order, okay, 100 times. But it's hard to visualize these things. And so if you talk about like the amount of plastic we generate, for example, I think it's something like 7 billion tons, maybe it's 9 billion. Anyways, it's like an astronomically incomprehensible amount of plastic is produced every year. And a lot of it is for stuff like packaging. And some percentage of it ends up in the ocean in these gigantic gyres where the currents circulate them into these huge, vast areas of floating, mostly plastic, but other waste as well. And so the fact that we've globalized our hunter-gatherer kind of mentality is like the problem in a way, because we sort of want to go into denial, and so and I cover this in my book, The Mythology of Progress, because the mythology of progress is in my view, a secular modern mythology that we don't recognize as mythology because we're advanced and we believe in science now and we don't need mythology. But we've created this secular mythology of progress in which everything that's not actually progress, which I call anti-progress, is ignored or kind of dismissed. So when you've got this floating mass of junk plastic the size of Texas floating in the Pacific, then, there's a technological solution. And so somebody comes up with a 1,000-foot boom that's floating around and it's supposed to gather all this up. And, if you think about the state of Texas, it's pretty big. It takes hours and hours to drive across it. And then you walk along a 1,000-foot boom and you say, oh yeah, this boom is going to clean up this entire thing, which is, by the way, floating at different heights, depths in the ocean. And it's like, it's just absurd. And a lot of the so-called technical solutions are similarly absurd, but we're bound by the mythology of progress to nod our heads and say, yes, there's a technological solution to every problem we've created by overconsumption and not really thinking about the consequences of the technology and industrialization. So every nation on earth has some measure of these issues. Now, whether it's polluted water or trying to get rid of their incredible waste from consumption, every society has to deal with these things. And globally, it's as we all know, it's like people like to give lip service to all this. We're going to coordinate a global effort, but nothing really happens because it's going to cost somebody who has power to do anything that's going to affect the flow of consumption and resources, right? Somebody's going to lose out. And so that person has wealth and power. They're going to make sure that they're going to defend the status quo. So there's that dynamic that's working against solutions that may seem common sense.
And yeah, I'll just add, you mentioned plastics since the thought came to my mind. I don't believe in man-made climate change, the narrative, the whole CO2 thing, but I believe in being good stewards of the earth, treating animals well, stewarding the earth, old school sort of conservation type stuff. And Here in Mexico, it's been about a year or two now where they removed plastic bags from all supermarkets, and that's happening in the U.S. and other jurisdictions. And at first, I was like bothered, hot and bothered, miffed. I'm using that word, but now actually I've gotten used to it, and I actually don't mind. And it's not that you buy we bought a permanent plastic box or these other fiber bags, and you just get used to it. And so I think, okay, that's not that bad. But and what you mentioned, I don't think it's so clear cut, because myself living on the edges of Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and thinking back, looking at the people living there, their homes, what they have to purchase, the energy they get. Looking back, it is pretty precarious. I lived in Samay, Kazakhstan, and you had these big coal smokestacks, and the system of this, it was very Soviet still. And at night, in the winters, you could see the black suit, and the systems were so precarious. That sort of speaks to, well, how abundant then are the resources, the wealth in the economy, if this is how the entire system is functioning. It's we're all hanging on the edge. But just, I guess, to go further, you sent me a couple of points. You talk about the nations going forward, nations that will increase their security, standard of living, and geopolitical influence will be those that reject growth equals prosperity, growth at any cost, as you mentioned, mythology of progress. And now there's a lot of talk about globalization, deglobalization, reglobalization, these regional formations like EU. Trump is talking about integrating Canada, USA, Greenland, Panama. So I feel like we're in a historical crossroads. And then, there's maybe with the financial system, because I think that's one of the keys. Where do you see this system? Is it spent? People are talking about a financial reset, that hyperinflation, the dollar. Where do you sort of see us?
That's an excellent idea of a starting point for another discussion. And again, I kind of go back to history, and it seems to me that every civilization, ours included, has two basic issues. How many resources are available for the civilization to use, and how are those resources distributed? And so, in other words, if you have a lot of resources, but only a few people get to use them, then of course you have a very unequal society, which is unstable as a result of that. And of course, the modern ideal is prosperity, or a good standard of living for every citizen. So that means that the distribution of these resources has to be somewhat equal. We understand the Pareto principle that 20% of the people are going to end up owning 80% of the assets, but nonetheless, we still want everyone to have a good life. And so that if that's the goal, and the term well-being is being tossed around as sort of a catch-all for that kind of thing. You can use standard of living. But the question about the standard of living is we've kind of locked ourselves into one metric, which is consumption. If we're growing consumption, if we're expanding our consumption, it means that life is getting better in every way and every day. And it's all like, well, wait a minute, is that really true? Because actually a lot of like what we think of as our standard of living is our stress level, our sense of financial security, our mental health, our access to healthcare, and so on. And so these things are harder to measure. So we just sort of like scrape those away and just look at GDP, consumption. And so I've done some experiments in my own life. I have a standard middle class life. I have a refrigerator with an ice maker, and I have a washing machine, and so on and so forth. I have all the internet and a bunch of laptops, and so I feel like I have all the material wealth that people around the world think of as like this is comfort and so on. And but I use about a third or to a quarter of the electricity and water that the average household in my area uses. Now there's two of us, and you could say, well, maybe they're using the standard family. Well, even if I'm still using less than half. And this, of course, households now in America, I think some huge percentage are one person, and so I don't know that 4 people is really a standard household size anymore. In any event, I have all the comforts of normal life. And yet, by just sort of a few behavioral things, like turning off the water heater when we're done taking a bath, and just keeping an eye on not wasting water, then I'm using like a third of what everybody else is doing. And so then this kind of raises a question like, well, what if we as a society paid a little more attention to what we're wasting without even being aware of it? And to your point about plastic bags, you can say, well, this is step in the right direction. And sometimes the government can mandate that. And your new president has to me a lot of good ideas about reverting to local food sources and food types, and instead of relying on globalized seeds and globalized production of food. I think these are very positive elements in terms of national self-reliance. So the government has a role, but it's also we can also choose ourselves, and communities can make it easier to save and so on. And so to save energy and resources without really affecting any of the ease or comfort or the other things that we think of as the good life. And so that's a narrative that I don't really read much about.
Yeah, you just another thought came to my mind. I'm having fun on LinkedIn, and I'm following a lot of interesting people, and some of them are posting, these nice little graphics on LinkedIn, and they say modern luxury is the ability to think clearly, sleep deeply, move slowly, live quietly in a world designed to prevent all four. They say modern wealth is an open calendar, socializing frequently, private time with your partner, working on interesting projects, traveling whenever you want to, doing very little of what you hate. A normal life is the opposite of this, and I'm trying to find others, but basically that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
And I have interactions with friends and family back in America still, and it just speaks to what you're saying, that we're told you have to get this job, you have to buy this car, you have to. And I just realized something speaking with someone who makes much more money than I do in America, and they're very consumerist, and they're locked into this lifestyle that's just stress. Whereas I don't have very much money. I'm like yourself, basically, middle class. But I'm planning to go back home to Croatia this summer for a number of months. And I'm thinking, well, this person that makes much more money than I do, they can't do that. I mean, where's the real wealth where basically I can go for 3 months with the whole family and just chill, on an island in Croatia or in Dalmatia? Which is more nice, having that ability, and I could still have a roof over my head. I could enough money for food, or this person who's trapped and they're like, no, I don't have enough vacation days. This kind of like, I prefer having less money and being able to chill out for 3 months than, being a slave to this system, because they got to pay the mortgage, they got to pay the car payment, they got to pay this, they got to pay that, and just like, and that speaks to what you're saying, where just downsizing. I'm a big fan of minimalism. So if you have any other thoughts, just on
that. You raised financialization, which is, finance. And I think that's a very important topic for us to discuss, because it's one of these dynamics that has kind of snuck in over the decades. And so therefore we lose track of how it's become dominant. And so, especially in the so-called developed economies, but actually in the developing economies, it's the same thing. The finance is now the dominant dynamic in the world. In other words, if there's a problem, then we turn to a central bank to solve it, or lowering interest rates so we can borrow more money, as if that's the solution. And maybe that's not even the problem, but and finance has become dominant in the economy, right? 40% of the entire economy or whatever is related to finance, like debt service, the stock market, and all the derivatives of finance, right? And then a lot of smart people are, we could say, to be blunt, squandering their lives and talent trying to make a killing in finance. And it's like, well, what does this have to do with the real world? And the answer kind of boils down to, well, if we make more money, to your point, then I'm going to have freedom and liberty and wonderfulness because I am now rich. And that's the point. And it's all like, yeah, but you're rich in money, which is a social construct, by the way. Because even gold is a social construct. We like to say, oh, everyone's a gold bug. Yeah. If you only buy this asset, then you're going to survive and be rich forever. And it's all like, well, other cultures are proof that sometimes it's cowrie shells or certain kinds of other things are the social construct that's considered wealth. And so we've sort of allowed this very constricted worldview, which is money and profit and capital accumulation are virtually all that matters. And this is the same in communist societies as well, or quasi-communist or socialist. And so, to your point, what's the real wealth? And so when we talk about resources, it's almost like the hidden agenda or the unspoken narrative is, well, we should have as much resources as we need to waste and squander mindlessly. And if we can't waste and squander it mindlessly, then something's wrong with the system. And it's all like, well, is that mentality, number one, healthy? Oh, and also, is it realistic? And so if we're going into a resource constricted world, which historically, by the way, there's lots of cycles of show that this is normal, the normal track of human civilization. And there's an author, David Hackett Fisher, who wrote a book called The Great Wave, Rice Revolutions and the Rhythm of History.
Oh, I've got it right behind me.
Yeah. And his point is, over time, it's like human population expands and the consumption of each individual person, i.e., per capita consumption, rises. And pretty soon you're using all the available resources in that civilization. Then price constraints lead to inflation, the decline of purchasing power of wages. People can't afford the essentials of life. They start getting upset. And then you have political and social revolutions. And so this era that we're living in right now is interesting because I think we've entered that exact paradigm. That our expansion of consumption is now, sort of consumed all the easy stuff. And now we're dealing with the idea that, well, we want to continue expanding consumption forever, but we live on a finite planet with resources that have costs associated with them. So, in other words, if we moved an entire mountain of dirt 30 years ago to get a handful of uranium or lithium or gold, and now we have to move 2 mountains to get the same handful of this resource we want, that's going to cost us a lot in diesel because all the machinery we use to move that mountain and process all that is diesel. And so you can't, substitute a battery for diesel. Not when the machine is the size of a small house. And so there's a lot of restraints like that we haven't seemed to process, or we haven't connected with the idea that, well, if we just used a third less and maintained all the good things we have in life, then we wouldn't need to dig move more mountains for stuff that we're going to throw away. And that mentality, I think it requires a change that's really hard for humans to make.
Particularly for Americans. And,
yeah.
I just thought back when I was living in Kazakhstan, we attended a church there, made many friends, and we'd visit the home. We were invited to the homes of Kazakhs, and for some of them did not have much wealth. I'm thinking back both in Kazakhstan and Mongolia, I realized tea, just simple, tea, that they would reuse tea bags. And I was kind of shocked when I came across this the first time because, in America and Europe, you use a tea bag once and you toss it. And I'm there in Nagobi or in Kazakhstan, like they're reusing it. And then you realize they don't have money, and they don't have easy access to, big supermarket shelves. There's a little shop in the middle of the desert and they have to wait, every month it comes the caravan to refill the shelves. And so you kind of learn about, and so the wealth is, you mentioned gold, but it's really family. Because I'd visit families where, the husband and wife have, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 children. They're living with the parents. That's the support network. It's worth more than gold, actually. And, they had stocks of cellars where, through the winter, they would can their foods that would carry them through. And also, just do you have a thought though? So what we're seeing now. You talk about how we're sort of hitting a wall, and you're seeing powers now look towards expanding into the Arctic, right, for resources there. So this is like we're looking at the final frontiers. So there's Arctic expansion into space, right, and I'm arguing also into cyberspace because we've reached the the analog world limits, and so now they're creating this whole digital economy. Like they're kicking the can down the road, creating all these digital currencies and digital systems and metaverses. So it's kind of like they're now expanding there because there's nowhere left here. And I'd also argue inward into our bodies. All this, biosecurity stuff, gene sequencing. Larry Ellison of Oracle, Trump just said we're going to spend 500 billion on AI stuff, and this is the guy who wants to give everyone a cancer vaccine and sequence all of our genes. And it's kind of like now they're trying to monetize our, our bodies. Just any thought on this desperation to just expand?
Yeah, well, Royer, I think you've nailed a key dynamic, which is how do you monetize stuff when you've already kind of consumed the real world or dominated it. And you also raise an implicit point here, which is look at the concentration of power and wealth that's now common around the world. In other words, that a handful of corporations dominate tech, a handful of corporations dominate healthcare in America, a handful of consumer corporations dominate the global economy, and so on. And the same can be said politically, right? That these core concentrations of wealth and power, they are, to me, part of the problem. And again, history has lots of examples of this, that when a monarch or tyrant, take your choice, has too much power, then they're prone to making errors and mistakes, and because there's no pushback. And that when we look at eras of global crisis in the past, for example, the early 1600s, there was climate change for whatever reason. There's lots of dynamics in play, but there was climate change. Summers got short, heavy rain, like basically winter never went away. Crops failed, and then nation states started wars. And that a lot of these were caused by sole power monarchs who decided that they were going to take advantage of the situation or something. And so there was, my point here being that in terms of systems dynamics, if a society and an economy has a bunch of competing elements that are competing openly, in other words, transparently, and that everybody involved in the society has a say in some way. They might have a political voice, or they might have a voice as a consumer or as a worker or as a small business owner. They have some way to influence the entirety. Then you're going to have a situation that's more likely to come up with solutions, right? Because someone can't just run roughshod over all the other interests in society and the economy. And so this is frustrating, of course, because we like to think, well, if we could just impose some, one solution on everybody, then we could get past this. But that actually turns out to be counterproductive, because that's not a solution for other interest groups in the society and in the economy. And so what we're kind of saying here is, if we have a diverse economy and society with a lot of competing interests, then we're more likely to find solutions. And in many cases, those solutions tend to be localized because there's so much diversity now in the world. And just listening to your stories of Mongolia and Kazakhstan, which are rather remote for most people. I mean, they're not on everybody's tourist card. But it goes to show the immense diversity of human life. And of course, you being a citizen of the world, you've experienced a lot of that diversity yourself, and so has everybody who's traveled a bit and actually lived with the locals as opposed to in the luxury resort. So the point being, is the system we've constructed conducive to an adaptation and evolution as needed, or is it been optimized for the self-interest of these concentrations of wealth and power who've lost sight of the common good and their impact and consequences on the planet?
And then, I guess just to go a bit further, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Steve St. Angelo. I've had him on the podcast. He talks about this energy cliff and just sort of, and what you just mentioned, that the book, I think, Great Wave, I actually haven't read it yet. It's been sitting there for years on my bookshelf, but that we're again in this moment. I'm seeing many signs in I just published my weekly paid subscribers newsletter last night, this morning, and I was looking at how, some of the indicators, coffee prices are skyrocketing, egg prices are skyrocketing. Kobayashi letter says the rich are getting richer faster than ever before. In Croatia now, there's reports that there's 100,000 plus empty but unaffordable apartments. Groceries are more expensive than in Switzerland and Croatia. So people are now beginning protests in Croatia, boycotting high food prices. It says 1 millionaire leaves Britain every 45 minutes under labor, and the government is just taxing and taxing and taxing. Even here, from my vantage point in Mexico, you see this general trend of, I think you've mentioned, neo-feudalism, this attack on the middle class. Homes prices were, the young generation, it's getting harder and harder to own anything, to purchase a car. And so I think it's also related to what you're saying. The resource issue, all the easy fruit has been taken, and then the complex systems are sort of reaching their limits. So thoughts on that and where we are, and then what this might look like, fleshed out in the Western economy. And often wars begin, as you mentioned, as a result. And sort of your thoughts on where you think we are on the edge of this cliff and how it might unfold.
Yeah, that's a great topic, and I would say I've written a lot about things like scale, like I mentioned, that we don't really. It's hard to grasp the scale at which we're influencing, global systems. The other one is optimization. That when you make financialization your core value and your core metric, then you're pretty much pushing everybody in the system, from CEO down to consumer, into this context or thought process where I need to optimize profit or gain, private gain. In other words, and that optimization ends up hollowing out a lot of these complex systems, because, and when things break down, then we look back and we go, well, how come there was no redundancy? How come there were no spare parts? And it's all like, well, that's expense. Expense is the enemy. Expense is the evil. So we can't keep a warehouse of spare parts anymore, because that costs money. That reduces our profit. So we get rid of that. We don't have any spare parts. Everything's just in time. And it's all like, okay. And then we having 3 suppliers for the solvents we need to make semiconductors or some other, scarce industrial product, of which there are thousands. And it's too expensive to have so let's just go to one source, one sole supplier. And so when that factory catches fire, then the entire global semiconductor chain is disrupted. And so we see that optimization has placed no value on resilience. And because if you're going to just base your entire culture on increasing profits next quarter, then I'm going to get fired for worrying about resilience. My job is to maximize profits every 3 months. That's it. And whatever I have to do that is my job. And so the system has been kind of wired, if you will, into stripping out a lot of the resilience that's we witness in natural systems. And Nassim Taleb has written about this in terms of fragility and anti-fragility. And a lot of his examples prove the point. I think one that always stuck with me was, if you're a chauffeur for a rich person, you're driving around one family or whatever, you're vulnerable to being fired, right? If you lose your job, you've lost your entire livelihood. Where if you're an Uber driver and you also, have have another sideline driving for people outside of Uber and Lyft, right? You just you've cobbled together your own network of people who call you to take them shopping or whatever. Well, then if you lose a customer, it's not so bad because you've got dozens. And so that sense of resilience requires redundancy, backups, and this includes what it was known as social technology. And this is a term I use in my book, Mythology of Progress. It's not my term. I borrowed it from others. And it talks about the way that are the systems that we have that operate. It's not just the technologies like the software and the computer. It's also how we've arranged the human labor and the hierarchy of command and all these other issues about how do we respond to problems. And so if you don't train your employees anymore, because that's a cost, then they're only used to functioning in a normal everyday situation. And when situations become extreme or out of the ordinary, they're lost. They don't have any experience in this and they weren't trained. And we see, unfortunately, we see that a lot beneath the surface, right? You talk to technicians and they're told, hey, I was given like almost no training. I had to look at YouTube to learn how to do my job. And it's taken me like a year to get comfortable with the tasks I'm doing. And so this optimization at the expense of system resilience is going to come. It's going to have a consequence. That things are going to start breaking down, especially in long global supply chains, and we're going to be incapable of fixing it because it's been optimized to break, essentially.
That made me think of, again, just what what I hear from my former workplace, that it seems like the quality of education maybe has been diluted, or whereas maybe back a lot of more of the teachers. I'm out of touch. I just talk to people who are in the circle, but it seems like maybe in the past, I could be wrong, people were just more concerned about the quality of the teaching that they were doing, and now it's just kind of more like, get as many students signed up as you can. It's a private school, and just care less about quality and just more about signing up the students, getting them through this credentialed system. And just what you're saying. Yeah, I see this in many places, speaking to the quality of services and goods. And, one of my goals, I feel I work to pay off my home, because as soon as possible, because that's like most people's biggest expense is rent or mortgage. And I figured if I can just get that out of the way, I'm going to have a lot more freedom, which I have now, because I don't have this sort of Damocles hanging over me where if I don't have enough money this month, I got to go, I'm going to pay the mortgage. And I'm just kind of like, if I didn't get enough money this month, okay, I didn't order as many steaks or something like that. And I can just continue. Stress is a big key. You mentioned stress earlier. I feel like that is a huge thing. It affects your health, physical, mental, and so forth. But just to what you're saying, is things breaking down. I'm curious. You mentioned also the quasi-empires, U.S., China, Russia. I spoke to Robert Kaplan, among other people, about, from time to time we're bringing up these. I view them, they're all empires. The EU is an empire. And so they're duking it out. What sort of fallout do you see? Who do you sort of? I think you agreed. I think with Kaplan. I've heard other people say this, that North America, U.S., is in a good position. The two walls of the oceans, great economy, resources in North America. Russia and China all have pros and cons. But how do you sort of see the state of the world, perhaps geopolitically, and these conflicts that we have? Russia, Ukraine, NATO, U.S., China, BRICS, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's we have to get to that, because that's the title of your podcast, right? And so I think what I'm trying to avoid getting labeled being pro-US, anti-US, or pro anybody or anti anybody. I think, again, I go back to just looking at history. And so if you want to put the task at hand, it's always about fast evolution and adaptation. Because that's, life is change, as many great philosophers and religious figures have reminded us. And so we're constantly forced to adapt and evolve. And so those societies, which includes culture and economy, politics, the entirety of that social order, if it's sort of been optimized to adapt and evolve, it's going to have a lot better chances of surviving, crises than a society that has maybe unbeknowingly been optimized for sclerosis, protection of self-interest, and so on. And to my previous point, when wealth and power are in these intensely concentrated, then those forces tend not to like change. They tend not to like adaptations or experimentation because all those are threats to their control and wealth. And so what you end up with is this strange dynamic where people are clinging on to what's failed because the people that are benefiting from the status quo feel that defending the status quo is the most important thing, and they'll spend their last cent defending the exact arrangement that's worked for them, blind to the fact that to save what they have, they're going to have to evolve or adapt. And so that I kind of look at every society that we have now and go, okay, let's analyze it in systems terms. How adaptable is it? And at all levels, cultural, social, economic, political, and at the national level, at the regional level, and at the local level, because, whether we're talking these huge land masses with huge diversity, right? China, Russia, the US, the EU, South America. I mean, these are like enormously complicated, diverse areas. So the likelihood that we're going to have some kind of like top-down fix that's going to work for these entire regions is kind of unlikely. And so that's part of what's wrong with the financialization and concentration of power is those at the top always think in terms of, well, I'm going to make a solution that's going to work for all 300 million of us or a billion of us. And it's typically, it's very difficult for leaders with concentrated power to say, you know what, we need to devolve power and capital down to the local level and then let them sort it out as best they can. And then if they come up with a solution, then let's share it because it might work elsewhere. And so that kind of experimentation is core to science, as we all know. So we like to talk about science and technology, but what's the core is, well, we experiment. We realize some are going to fail. We collect data and we try to make an objective assessment of whether that experiment is going to work better than the way we're doing things now. And so that's to look at each society that exists now and say, well, how adaptive are they? That's a value judgment. And people from the outside are going to have a different view from those inside. And so I don't know if we can make that kind of assessment, but I think that's the core metric we should be looking at. And so my book, Global Crisis, National Renewal, could be applied to every society. I don't know any society well enough other than America to really discuss. But I think it applies to every society, which is if you are willing to accept the fact we need to use less and by extracting more, getting more value out of the resources we're using, increasing our standard of living by using less, not more, that society is going to have a lot easier time than societies that are locked into the idea that we need to always grow by consuming more. And without looking at, well, could we have a better life by using a third less or even a half less? Is that possible? Let's look at that. So to your point earlier about your own life and stress, that's the thing. If you feel that you've got to always have more of everything, while your actual security of your health and well-being is declining, that just creates stress, and then you make poor decisions. And I think that's an issue too. Which society is under so much stress that they're likely to make poor decisions? And so, if we look at the standard of living as like the level of stress required to function in that society, then I think a lot of societies that consider themselves very successful are actually really poor. They're really poor in terms of the wealth of security and how else you want to call it, the lack of stress, and the comforts of life and so on. So um, that's my context for geopolitics. And so I don't see any of the current empires jostling for resources as having grasped this basic reality that the future is going to go to those who want to extract resources but get far more value out of them. And that's what we call productivity, right? I mean, if you can extract 10 times more work and more uh, good stuff out of a barrel of oil than your competitor, then you need 10% of the oil that they do, because they're still sitting in traffic jams burning off hundreds of millions of gallons of fuel. And so it's I don't see anybody getting it yet, but whoever does first will have the dominance that everybody seeks in the global um, frame, because they'll have surplus resources instead of scarcities, and they'll have the solutions while everybody else is trying to strip mine the Arctic. And to your point, I think that's I think it's important to point out all of the important elements of that kind of land grab or resource grab. They're often only visible to real experts, and I'm not. But I do know things like, because of global warming, for whatever reason, the permafrost is melting in the north in a lot of places, and so you can't pave a road over it like you could when the Alaskan oil boom started in the early 70s. Well, if you can't pave a road hundreds of kilometers to get to this remote place with tremendously bad weather, then how are you going to do it? You're going to get a drone. You're going to airlift everything. Well, then how much is that oil going to cost per barrel? It's already just stupidly expensive to drill, to put a platform at sea, drill down, 2 miles, and then go sideways to get the oil. It's like there's just no way to do this cheaply, and that's the point, that to your point about rising prices, there's just no cheap way to do this anymore. And so people go, well, technology, it's getting better, and it's all like, yeah, incrementally. The jet engine is now a little more efficient, uses 5% less jet fuel, so on and so forth. The mining, operation uses 5% less diesel. But that incremental kind of improvement is not going to be enough. And so we have to face that reality and say, well, how do we get more out of what we already are collecting as resources, right? And so we go back to things like Americans waste apparently 40% of all the food. I mean, that's an astounding number. And we say, well, everyone's complaining about high prices. How is it that we waste 40% of the food we gather and process? I mean, and so I think my point there is, obviously we need a change, or perhaps a revolution in cultural values.
And just to add on one of your points, technology improving, I just, I'm thinking of artificial intelligence, AI, and okay, let's say that's an improvement. You need less of a workforce. These people can, um, look for new jobs, maybe will be created, but AI is going to use a massive amount. I mean, it's shocking to be learning this, the amount of electricity and energy that AI is going to be, the data centers. I've read it, like in the state of Virginia, I think 25% of electricity now will alone go to the Microsoft, whatever, Google, Oracle, OpenAI, AI data centers. And that's, here in Mexico, they're piling in. Amazon just announced in Querétaro, they're building massive data centers. And it's just, so, okay, yeah, that's an improvement, but that's still, we've still got a problem. And do you see, so basically you're saying, the Bible talks about man being like an ass and donkey, right? Who needs to be constantly whipped because he just doesn't get it. And so is that sort of the case now, as you say, with our nations? In many ways, what you speak about, I see it as interchangeable, the values of our experiences as individuals, as the same goes for nations and consumption and all that. Do you see basically all of us and the nations and the empires just learning things the hard way as usual. And also any thoughts on attempts at new arrangements, right? There's these international arrangements of, again, BRICS, things that are going on with the EU, different initiatives here in the US now. So did you just sort of see them rearranging the chairs on the decks of the Titanic? Or do you see any, are you optimistic on any initiatives?
That's a great topic, and I'm glad we're kind of coming around to that. My basic premise is, I admit, unusual, and I think we need a new mythology. And I think that as long as we're kind of trapped in this mythology of progress, which sees any technological advance, like for your example, AI, as like an unmitigated good, and all we need to do is let this thing run wherever it's going to run, and it's going to fix all of our problems. And that the standard of living and the goal of a good, happy human life is only possible if we're consuming more forever. We have to be able to let go of that, I think. I don't think that that's actually productive. I think that in terms of what I call anti-progress, I think life is a lot worse now than it was 40 years ago. And because I'm old, I remember life. It was a lot easier to make a living. It was a lot easier to afford life. And there was less stress because we didn't have all this shadow work. For example, every day we have to sit down and waste our valuable life deleting spam and protecting all of our devices from hacking. And so there's this huge cost to the modern life that we feel as stress, because to my original point, we're still running wetware 1.0, and so we're not really optimized for the kind of stress that we're dealing with. And so then we turn to medications, and our mental health is decayed or under stress, and yet we don't measure that as part of our decision making process. It's like, well, did we make more money? Did we get richer? And it's all like, well, if we consider our mental health and stress level as the core wealth of being alive, then I'd say, well, I think we're all a lot poorer, not by a little bit. We're a lot poorer now. And so the stresses that you mentioned about rising food prices and the impossibility of buying a home in much of the world, these things are not factored in, and they should be. So coming back around to solutions, I think we need to fashion a new mythology, one that recognizes the limits of wetware 1.0 a little more, and the limits of our planet, and the limits of the metrics we're using. We need to refashion our metrics of what a good standard of living means, or what prosperity means, or what national wealth means, right? And so how do we get there? And it's funny, I've tried to study social revolutions, meaning I don't mean political, where, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. And I don't mean an economic revolution, like a new technology comes in and changes society. I mean a social values revolution. And there are a few. And here in America, and I think around the world, some of these things occur over decades. For instance, the separate but equal fallacy of racial bias and prejudice took decades to erode, but it did finally crack. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but there's been a social change of attitude about a lot of things in society. And so we could see the same kind of thing, where we're not changing politics per se, or the economy per se, or technology per se. We're changing what we value and what incentives we're going to respond to. And so that's all kind of touchy-feely and vague. And it would be easier to say, yeah, but OpenAI's 2.0 is going to fix all of our problems. And so that's why we love technology, is it offers us the idea we don't have to get our own hands dirty changing anything. Somebody somewhere else is going to fix all of our problems with a new technology. But if we look at the problem as being one of mythology that's broken, or a social set of values and incentives that are broken, then our work changes, in terms of like, well, what needs to change first?
I just had a few thoughts there, and this relates to my future question on. You wrote a great piece on your Substack. Again, people can find your Substack, links are in the description. Is digitization catastrophic for civilization? And I had on one of my former sponsors, great guest, Mikhail Thorup. He's Canadian, lives in Panama. He's constantly traveling the world, and I've asked him. I've honestly, as of late, just gotten tired of traveling. I don't care anymore. Nationally, okay, maybe in Mexico, I can hop in a car, go an hour, 2, 3. That's fine, or take a flight. Within Mexico, I might be going to Cuba soon, not too far away. But traveling again, I've seen enough where I kind of don't care for it. Number one, and number two, I think is going to what you're saying. People are seeking these material experiences, and I think wealth is, I don't want to go new age here. People know I'm not with that stuff, but more inner spiritual stuff where I don't need to go on some holiday. And I'm just happy these days having a home, having some mobility. I can eat whatever I want. I have clothes. I can just sit with a coffee on my patio, looking at the sun, chatting with friends, reading a book, playing my guitar. That for me is like where I get my value. And I've talked about here in Latin America, we got a lot of problems, corruption. And what would it take to change things is kind of what you're saying, though. I think the answer is it's a cultural revolution. Like to stop these cartels, this culture of corruption. A lot of it is the culture here, And so, how do you change that? And what you're talking about, this sort of new mythology, or it's in a way, it's a social or cultural revolution. How would that happen?
Yeah. And so then we look on the positive side of digital culture, which is, as you and I were speaking before we started recording, you used to teach 30 students and now you can reach 30,000 people. And then those people, can touch another 30,000 and so on. And so it's like, what's the catalyst? And it's interesting to look at that. And if you look at any nation's history, you'll find these points of social catalyst, and that often lead to political change, but not necessarily. Could be a religious kind of movement, or it could be a cultural movement. And so, what's the catalyst? And so, history suggests it's just what you said. It's prices of food and essentials. If you can't afford shelter, you can't afford food, and you're stressed to get a livelihood, then your mind opens to like this. You finally admit the status quo is not working. It's not working for me. And I look around, it doesn't seem like it's working for everybody else either, although we all act like it is. And so there's a certain play acting there that we kind of play along and go, yeah, this is great. But actually our lives are worse, and we're struggling. So I think that's where we'll get a catalyst, is when things really become unaffordable, then people are going to have to, what was acceptable to them will no longer be acceptable. That's my language as of what a mythology does. A mythology sort of sets the boundaries on what we find acceptable and unacceptable. And so if we say, you know what, this is the fact that I can't afford anything anymore, that's no longer acceptable. What are we going to do about it? And so the internet gives us an opportunity to find solutions that we can kind of coalesce around or become loyal to, right? And if they seem to work, they can spread like wildfire, and that's my hope.
I wanted to get, and yeah, I think also we've begun to see examples, thanks to the quote public health emergency of the 2020s. A lot of that woke up a lot of people and forced change. I've heard of people who are not even Christian, who are more open to homeschooling, and different solutions that used to sort of be weird, and now it's like their hand has been forced. And I don't know how much you follow Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. I think I've interviewed him like a dozen times over that decade, but I love his missives when he complains about the digital transformation, and maybe just get your thought on the negative. So there are positives, as you say. I'm able to work from home now. I can talk to pretty much whoever I want. So there are amazing things, but there's a dystopian aspect to it. In 2020, I interviewed Jewish historian Edwin Black, who wrote about IBM and the Holocaust. and he uses this term for this social credit system. He calls it the algorithm ghetto, right? And so more and more, this concentration of power that we spoke of earlier, they're pushing us into this digital realm, which is making it easier to control more people. And if you make one wrong move, you can be deplatformed. I'm banned from PayPal. I'm banned from Patreon. So those were avenues of making a living for me that have been shut off. People are getting debanked. And soon, if we have like digital passports and digital IDs, I couldn't renew my bank card. I've told this 3 months ago here. I used the same, in the past, I would always use my Mexican American passport, renew my debit. And this time they said, no, you have to have the national digital ID of Mexico, the voting card, which I never took out. And so slowly it feels like you're seeing the walls close in on that regard. Just any further thought on, this sort of neo-feudal, digital neo-feudalism?
That's a great summary for you. I think that's it. It's a digital neo-feudalism, and it has a Kafkaesque, Franz Kafka's kind of world that he described in his novels, where we don't understand what's going on because it's all kind of, the machinery's hidden from us. And so there's these sort of incomprehensible rules we're supposed to follow. And then if you want to object or appeal, there's no one to go to. So when you get deplatformed and by big tech, as I know myself, just from being shadow banned, which is even more pernicious and sinister, because it appears your posts are still there, but it's just no one else can see them. So, there's lots of permutations of this kind of, I call it, it's also the digital gulag, that you're given a 10-year sentence in the digital gulag, and you don't even, there's no appeal. You can't call somebody up at big tech and say, hey, I think you guys got this wrong. No, there's nothing. In fact, you don't even know what crime you were accused of, or the sentence, and there's no appeal. So this in itself is sinister. That it's unlike civil society, where there's a legal system of some kind. There's no recourse in big tech neo-feudalism. You can't even go to the noble, the castle on the hill, and beg for forgiveness or what. And so I think it is extremely dangerous. And another factor I mentioned in the article that you referenced on Substack is that it's also by digitizing the analog world to where your washing machine and refrigerator have a motherboard, and your car is totally dependent on digital, processors. When those things fail, they're very difficult to repair because, like, for instance, the Ford Model A, which was, made in the 30s, there's a number of them still running, and somebody still can make money by making parts. In other words, you can cast the axle and so on, and you have enough sales to make a living. But if you're looking at a motherboard, and because I've been involved in tech for various levels over the last 30 years, I actually know what this stuff is. So, like, when I had to replace the motherboard on a dryer because it had failed, and then you look at it and you go, it's this big plastic thing with a circuit board, which is unique, by the way. It's not like you can go buy that 5 years from now. That was produced in one run for this thing. An Omron, it's a Japanese brand of commodity chip, a couple Omron chips, and then this you can't make this again because none of those parts are going to be available in 6 months, never mind 6 years. And no one's going to stockpile that. And so we've created a society where we virtually are going to have to throw everything away, and at tremendous waste of resources, because we've become dependent on all this digital components, which are not stored, not in stock, they're not going to be made again in the same way. And so it's impossible. All these pins have to connect in a certain way. And this is just one appliance, but it's true of everything. Every car, every device we have that's digital, or dependent digitally, it's like this board is going to be impossible to remake. So it's not like an axle that you can go and cast a new one. And so that's also extremely pernicious, and we don't understand that yet, but we're going to understand it more as more and more things turn into bricks. In other words, they become like something that just goes to the landfill or recycling because that digital component is no longer available. So, yeah, we're under assault in two forms of neo-feudalism: in the analog world of real world stuff breaking down, and then in the digital world where we're constantly imposed on with shadow work, and then we're also under the thumb of hidden powers, if you will, which is what big tech decides in the algorithm ghetto.
No, I mean, I think
And
this
so,
is
yeah,
it's just frightening because it affects so many of our lives. I mean, you save a lot of money, you buy a car, and then they won't make parts for it anymore. Or just even I use an old smartphone. I barely use my smartphone, and it's happened once or twice where I tried to download an app and it says your phone is too old now, and the app can't be downloaded. And it's just like the system is forcing, and the phone is perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. It's many years old. It's in pristine condition, but you got to buy now. It's obsolete. So they force this obsolescence on you. And I'm just curious what you make of the whole Bitcoin crypto space. I can't wrap my head around it. You had the Trump coin the other day, the Melania coin, some quote Christian pastor preacher who spoke at his Trump's inauguration was pumping a coin, and I'm just thinking the CEO of Coinbase is saying Bitcoin is going to be worth millions and millions. Like one Bitcoin is going to be worth millions, and for me, I can't like I just stopped and thought, when and ever history has any item, asset, anything been worth millions? Like it just doesn't make sense. Make it make sense. And all I can think is tulip mania. I don't. Do you have any thought on Bitcoin and crypto?
I do, and I think to your point, the sort of mass psychosis of speculation is another factor in modern life that and I think that it infects everything from 0-day options in Nvidia to cryptocurrencies to speculating on the next big thing that's going to make me a multimillionaire overnight. That's driven, I think, partly by the sense that people have that they can't get ahead by the traditional ways. It's like very hard to advance your career or save enough money to have a nice life, and so then you're sort of drawn into the casino of financial speculation as the only way to get ahead. And so that's a lot of the driver behind this crypto mania. Back in 2016, 15 and 16, I actually, people have been telling me about Bitcoin for years by then. And so I read the Satoshi original paper, and I did as much work as I could to understand it. And it seems to me at the time I concluded cryptocurrency could go another direction. In other words, it's actually a very pliable technology. And I proposed a use of cryptocurrency, which I thought would be create a beneficial world, which is the name of my book, a radically beneficial world, which was crypto could be used to create a currency that was tied to human labor, so that everybody that did useful work would get paid in a cryptocurrency that was created solely by their labor. It wasn't created by mining it or some authority. It was created by individuals doing useful work in their community. And it is a radical conception of what cryptocurrency could be used, because right now what it's viewed as an artificial scarcity, right? It's digital gold and all that stuff. And my idea was, why are we making it something scarce that only rich people can afford and hoard? Why aren't we using cryptocurrency to create money at the bottom of the pyramid instead at the top? And I thought that would prove much more socially beneficial and more economically beneficial. My point being, even if you disagree with my idea, the point is cryptocurrencies could go in a far different direction with a different protocol and a different set of incentives. And so we've kind of fallen into this one thing that goes back to one paper by Satoshi, and that there's a lot of other options in how cryptocurrency could go. And this speculative mania that you describe, I think, is the wrong path. I don't think that's a positive way forward.
Yeah, my question was, as you say, I think there can be good uses of this technology, and I had a past sponsor of the podcast years ago. People can check the archives. It's called Nomos Time Bank, and this person created this app where you would download it. It could be used in Mexico, it could be used in America, and basically the idea was to get people in your community downloading using the Nomos Time Bank. It's like an alternative currency where, if you get a service for someone for half an hour, you get half hour of time in your bank, or they'll get a half an hour, and then they can spend that half hour with someone else. And the person just ended up canceling that project because no one was buying into it. It sounds similar to what you were talking about, but my just question was, where we've gone, as you say, with Bitcoin and crypto, is just not making any sense. And it doesn't seem sustainable. Like, I just can't see how Bitcoin can be worth $1 million. It might hit, that price, but I just don't. I feel like there's going to be some sort of coming down to earth. Do you?
Yeah, I would say that every form of money, whatever it is, Bitcoin, gold, fiat currencies, shells, whatever, everything will rise if there's more capital flowing into it, and then it will lose value if capital starts leaving it. And so if we're in a world where we're printing trillions of dollars in central banks and private banks, there's trillions sloshing around that can go in and out of an asset, then you get these speculative bubbles. But once the capital starts disappearing, vanishing, as debts are defaulted, and printing money is understood as a problem, not a solution, then money's going to flow out of virtually every asset, and we can't predict which one will top the list of that collapses first, but they'll all collapse because the capital is phantom. So if we're creating trillions of units of phantom capital, it's going to vanish and go to money heaven. Then it's going to flow out of every asset. So every asset bubble is going to crash, whether it's real estate, Bitcoin, even the precious metals. Because that's my view of it. It's real simple. It's like in and out. If you're creating a bunch of phantom capital, that it can blow up the value of all kinds of assets, but once that capital vanishes or decays or goes away, then it's going to flow out of every asset, whether anybody thinks that's possible or not. And of course, at the top of every bubble, everyone's sure it's different this time.
Yeah, I mean, I read some of the comments of the Bitcoin maxis, and again, I've never seen anything like this. I do want to ask you about, looking at some solutions you wrote. Again, another recent great blog piece. Was that just today? I'm getting lost. The do-it-yourself decade. You said, I'm calling the next 10 years the do-it-yourself decade. Is whatever we want to happen will increasingly be up to us to do for ourselves. Again, in much of the third world, as I've mentioned, in Mexico, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, people will tend to fix things themselves, not throw, like in America or Europe, worse in the US, you'll just throw away something just as mildly broken, you throw it away and you buy a new one. I mean, there were extremes where when I lived in Mongolia, you're in the Gobi Desert, if you can't fix it yourself, you are literally dead. They would often, we'd often drive 5 to 10 people in one vehicle. There would be Jeeps where they'd remove the back seats and there's 10 people in the Jeep. And we went to some music festival in the desert and there's no roads. I mean, you're literally driving through the desert and there's nothing. And the car broke down in one instance. I've got photos of this. the car broke down. Something was wrong. No, get this: the one of the axles underneath the car broke. Um,
Wow.
and lucky they were carrying a tent with wooden, what do you call it? Wooden poles. And so they managed to jerry rig it, of the wood to hold it until we got to the next like village. Because if I mean you're stuck there with like 10 people, you're dead, Or and then another time something happened with the engine, and I saw the driver just sitting on the engine, banging away at something, had no idea what it was doing, and he managed to fix it. And this can happen in minus 30 degrees winter if you're driving through the tundra, the steppes, the desert. And if you can't, I mean, you're going to freeze to death, So it's just mind-boggling. And so where was I going with this? Just sort of your thought on, and again, this influenced me when I read your book, one of your books 10 years ago, where I can't just rely on my employer. I have to become an entrepreneur. I have to learn some skills. I learned podcasting, and you need to learn how to do some work around the house, and instead of always defaulting to some serviceman. And so just thoughts on how people going forward in this neo-feudalism, this digital neo-feudalism, what people can do to sort of survive and hopefully in some cases thrive.
Yeah, and I think I think you've given a good example of your own, which is with your mobile phone and using an old phone and using it sort of sparsely. And of course, it's quickly obsoleted to make you force to buy a new one. But the idea of we can't reduce our dependence on these huge complex systems and institutions completely. And that's not my goal. It's like, but if you can reduce your dependence by half, and that's a huge step forward. And it's kind of equivalent to your what you mentioned by getting rid of debt. If you can pay off your house. Now that's a big ask. That's a big goal. But if you can reduce your debt, then that's a way of reducing your dependence on the system. And so if we can just simply reduce our dependence, that's another way of saying we're increasing our freedom and our liberty. As to your point, that you made so eloquently earlier. If you can live without total dependence on these complex systems, then you have more freedom of movement, you have more options in life, and therefore you can kind of optimize your own opportunities, really, in a way that you can't if you're totally dependent on the systems. And so, yeah, how do we increase our self-reliance is kind of the goal. And it's like, well, as you say, the more you know how to do, and just thinking differently about things, just thinking, well, could I get by on less and still have a good life? That's a pretty good start right there. And who do I know that can help me? We can trade labor or share stuff. And so you realize that it's a community, as to your point about the places you live that were remote, and your community and your family are core assets, if you will, not trading options, on your phone. That's really not the asset you think it is, and the real assets are elsewhere. And so if we invest our time and energy in these other assets, then they'll, of course, grow in value. And so I'm kind of suggesting minimizing financialization and digitization as much as possible. And people tell me, yeah, well, my appliance broke down and it's digital and there's nothing I can do about it. It's unrepairable. And I said, yeah, by design, it's unrepairable. And of course, there's a whole movement for demanding corporations make things repairable. But so there's limits on what we can do, but there's also a lot of opportunities. And so I'm kind of suggesting, I think a lot of these digital technologies are addictive by design, just like they're planned obsolete by design, and product cycles, obsolete it. So the addiction is also intended, it's planned, because that's how you make money, is to engage the person. So realizing that these are addictive, kind of like snack food or whatever, well, then you just get rid of the snack food in your house. You just don't have any. So it's not a temptation. And you get rid of the digital stuff. You just don't look at it anymore. And then you have more time and energy to do something in the real world that's beneficial for you and your family. And that sounds kind of trite, but I try to live it, and it is hard, it's not like sacrifice free, and to your own point, you had to put in a lot of work to learn how to be an entrepreneur and to maximize the value of your skill set. And you pulled it off, but it took years.
Yeah, I mean, I still have people ask me that when I get into podcasting, I'm like, Patrick Henningsen, he's a colleague, 21st Century Wire. He gave a speech at a conference last year, and he said, 10 years. You got to put in 10 years, first before you can expect anything. And I'm sure in your case, with writing, in my case, building up for free, right? Building up this podcast archive, which led to other opportunities. And just going back to what you're saying, I've just more as I get older, I'm like, I want the analog. I don't want this digital. I'm just happier being in the analog. And here in Mexico, it's sunny most of the year. I don't have a dryer. There's Mexicans that have dryers. They have these little digital dryers, and I'm like, I just hang my clothes, outside to dry in the sun. Why do I? It's a expense. It uses gas as well, electricity. And it breaks down. You got to repair it. That's one last repair I have to think of. And even when you mention products, I think we still have with some things, if you put in a lot of research for whatever you're looking to purchase, you might still find an item that's not like how, that can last a while and be repaired. And so we've covered a lot. Is there anything that you think is also important to get across that we haven't mentioned from your body of work or otherwise?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that opportunity. I think if we look at the global situation or geopolitics, it's always like at this sort of a high level of abstraction, and we can look at what other leaders or globalists or whatever are going to do or say they're going to do. It's at some point, I think it's better to put our energy into whatever we can change in our own lives directly, and it's interesting, and geopolitical things will impact us, and we hopefully won't have any armed conflicts, that affect us. But I think that even at a national level, the solutions are coming from us as individuals and in local communities where people are looking at the community they live in, whether it's a city or a county or a village, and saying, well, how can we make life easier for all of us somehow? What can we do? Can we use less? Can we recycle more? Can we create more job opportunities for people, and so on? So, yeah, I think the local solutions are going to be important, not just for each of us as individuals, but for nation states and the globe too. And so, if we share the ideas that work for us, or we find other people's ideas that work for us, that's where I think the solutions are going to come from, more like localized and a change of values that we're promoting, and so that's, I think, the value of your podcast. You're sharing a huge number of new ideas, and that's the experimentation and that we need to evolve and adapt.
Yeah, and I've noticed more and more people coming to this conclusion. The one that you're talking about now is it's fun for me. It's exciting still to get a pulse on what's happening around the planet. But ultimately, when we look at solutions, whether it's from the digital, what do I call digital neo-feudalism or insecurity conflicts, it's the life around you, physically where you are. And there's listeners in Latin America, Canada, America, Europe, other parts of the world, and it's just basically, yes, we're analyzing what's happening on the planet, but ultimately, it's about your neighborhood where you live. And so, yeah, great advice. Like I said, you got a lot of books. All your links are in the description. You want to tell? Are there any projects we should know about? Services? Tell us about where people can find you and all that.
Just visit me at of2minds.com. Samples of my books for free, or Charles Hugh Smith on Substack. And thank you so much for the opportunity to cover a huge range of topics.
I've never been to Hawaii. I've never gotten close. So maybe someday. It sounds like a fascinating place to be. And again, follow Charles's blog, check out his books, and again, as always, thanks for being my guest.
Thank you for the invitation.